This woman didn't just fail as a mother, she became a nightmare in human form. She shattered every instinct of love and protection, replacing them with cruelty, torture, and death. A mother by name, a monster by nature, she didn't nurture her children, she broke them, starved them, burned them, and when they no longer served her purpose, she discarded them like trash. And when the truth threatened to come to light, her response wasn't just remorse, she brutally killed 2 of her kids and kept their bodies in a freezer. A freezer, sealed shut, hiding a truth too horrific to comprehend. They had been there for 2 years, lifeless, frozen, discarded like old leftovers. 2 years of silence. 2 years of deception. 2 years of a mother pretending her murdered children never existed. How does a mother commit such unthinkable acts against her own flesh and blood? What happens when the cycle of abuse continues, unchecked and unstoppable? And how did one little boy's word seal the fate of his older sister? Before we dive into this disturbing case, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more chilling tales of love, lies, and betrayal. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters, are the ones we call mother. Shanice Lavelle was born into violence. Raised in pain. From the moment she took her first breath, the world had already decided her fate. Her mother, Delphina Lavelle, was not a nurturer, not a protector, she was a force of terror, a woman who believed discipline was best delivered through fists, belts, and scalding hot water. Shanice never knew what it meant to be loved. She knew only the sting of leather against her skin, the weight of her mother's fury, the cold silence that followed after the screams stopped. There was no tenderness, no comfort, just pain. Pain that became so familiar, it no longer felt foreign. It became normal. Expected. Neighbors heard the beatings. They heard the cries that seeped through the thin walls of their apartment. But they looked away. They turned up their televisions, shut their blinds, whispered behind closed doors, but no one ever stepped in. No one saved her. And as Shanice grew older, the rage inside her festered. But instead of breaking the cycle, she embraced it. If pain was all she had ever known, then pain was all she had to give. To the world, she was just another struggling single mother, a woman doing her best to raise 4 children in a system that was designed to watch her fail. Welfare workers saw the late bills, the empty fridge, the unkempt home, but they never looked close enough. Never close enough to see the bruises, the burned scars, the raw terror in her children's eyes. There were 4 of them. Kira, 13. The eldest daughter, the mother's helper, the one who bore the heaviest weight. She cooked. She cleaned. She raised her younger siblings while trying to survive the wrath of a mother who seemed to hate her most. Zamir, 10. The eldest son. The one who suffered the worst. He was small for his age, weak, the easiest target. Shanice didn't just hit him, she broke him, piece by piece, stripping away any hope he had left. Nyla, 7. The quiet one. The one who learned early on that the best way to survive was to disappear, to shrink herself into the corners of the room and pray that her mother forgot she existed. And then there was Kaysen, 4. The baby. The only one Shanice seemed to love. He was untouched, unharmed, fed while his siblings starved, comforted while they cried. He was the golden child, the favored son, the only one whose survival was never in question. No one suspected what was happening behind those doors. No one saw the monsters lurking within. But for those children, the nightmare had no end. Every day was a new terror, a new punishment, a new lesson in pain. And for 2 of them, it would all end in the most horrifying way imaginable. Inside that apartment, discipline wasn't about teaching, it was about breaking. Shanice Lavelle didn't just punish her children. She tortured them. Locked away in dark rooms for days, their stomachs twisted in hunger, their tiny hands clawing at the door, begging for food that would never come. When they cried too loudly, when they disobeyed, when they did anything she deemed wrong, she found new ways to make them suffer. Boiling water became her weapon of choice. She would heat it on the stove until it bubbled and roared, then pour it over their fragile skin, watching as they writhed, their screams echoing through the walls. The burns left them scarred, blistered, forever marked by her rage. But that was never enough. She needed to see them break. Belts. Extension cords. Metal pipes. Whatever was closest, whatever could do the most damage, that's what she used. A single misstep meant agony. A wrong word meant blood. And any sign of defiance? That meant death. Kira was the first. It started with a whisper. Kason, the baby, the only one Shanice truly loved, came to her, teary-eyed, saying that Kira had been mean to him. That was all it took. A single complaint, a small grievance from her golden child, and Kira's fate was sealed. Shanice dragged her eldest daughter into the bathroom, ignoring the girl's terrified pleas, her desperate cries for mercy. But mercy wasn't something Shanice knew. She turned on the stove. Boiled the water. And then, with no hesitation, she poured it over Kira's bare skin. The girl's screams were deafening, the scalding liquid peeling away layers of flesh. She convulsed, her body writhing in unbearable agony. But Shanice didn't stop. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Kira's suffering continued until the screaming stopped, until her body was too weak to fight anymore. And then, with her daughter barely clinging to life, Shanice grabbed an electrical cord, looped it around her throat, and pulled. Kira struggled, gasping, her small hands clawing at the cord, but her mother's grip was unyielding. Tighter. Tighter. Until finally, silence. She was gone. Shanice wrapped her in plastic like she was nothing more than a piece of trash and dragged her lifeless body to the freezer. She stuffed her inside, slamming the door shut, sealing away the evidence of her crime. But the hunger for violence only grew stronger. Zamir was next. He had always suffered the worst, and yet he had managed to survive. Starved, beaten, burned, his small body bore the evidence of years of torment. But still, he lived. One night, he could take it no longer. His stomach twisted in pain, gnawing, aching. In the darkness, he crept out of his room, his tiny feet silent against the floor. He made his way to the kitchen, desperate for even a crumb of food. But before he could take a single bite, she caught him. Shanice's fury ignited like a flame. This wasn't just defiance, this was betrayal. She grabbed a metal pipe from the corner of the room. Zamir barely had time to react before the first blow landed. Crack. He crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from his mouth, his small body convulsing from the impact. But Shanice didn't stop. She swung again. And again. And again. By the time she was done, he wasn't moving. With cold indifference, she wrapped his broken body, just as she had done to Kira, and dragged him to the freezer. She opened the door, her hands unbothered by the sight of her dead daughter's frozen remains, and placed him beside her. The door shut. And just like that, they were gone. For Nyla, survival was an art. She had learned early that defiance was a death sentence. That fighting back only made things worse. She had seen it with Kira. She had seen it with Samir. She knew better than to scream, to cry, to beg. Instead, she became a shadow. A ghost within her own home. She endured the beatings without a sound, her small body absorbing every slap, every kick, every lash of the belt. She did not protest. She did not resist. When she was locked away in the dark, left alone for days without food or water, she did not bang on the door. She did not call out for help. She sat in silence, her hunger gnawing at her insides, her body growing weaker with each passing day. She had no protector now. No Kira to shield her. No Zamir to take the worst of it. She was alone. And yet, she lived. Because Nyla understood something her siblings never did: obedience was survival. But in that house of horrors, there was one child who never had to fight to survive. Kaysen. The baby. The golden boy. The only one their mother loved. He was fed while Nyla starved. Held while she shivered in the dark. Kissed on the forehead while she nursed her wounds in silence. He was her pride, her proof to the world that she was still a mother. And he never saw himself as a victim, because he never was. Kaysen watched as his siblings suffered. Watched as they disappeared one by one. But he was too young to understand. Too small to grasp the horror unfolding around him. And so, the years passed. 2 years. 2 years of silence. 2 years of carrying the weight of a secret buried in ice. Kira and Zamir's bodies lay untouched in the freezer, preserved in death, frozen in time. And still, life went on. Shanice continued collecting welfare checks in their names, spending money meant for children who no longer existed. When family members asked about Kira and Zamir, she lied. They had moved away, she said. They were living with their father. They were safe. And no one questioned it. No one looked close enough. Because no one ever does, until it's too late. For months, her landlord had tried to get her out. Eviction notices piled up, ignored. Warning after warning, demand after demand, she never responded. He had given her chance after chance, waiting for the overdue rent that never came. Calls went unanswered. Visits to the apartment were met with locked doors and silence. At first, he thought she had skipped town. That she had abandoned the place like so many struggling tenants before her. But something felt off. Neighbors rarely saw her. The windows were always shut, curtains drawn. When she did step outside, she never lingered, never made small talk. It was as if she was hiding from the world. And then, there was the smell. A neighbor had complained once, a faint, sickly odor drifting from her unit. The landlord chalked it up to poor housekeeping. But he had no idea. No idea that behind those locked doors, a horror beyond imagination was waiting to be found. When the final deadline came and went with no payment, no response, no sign of life, he made the call. Enough was enough. Authorities arrived to evict her once and for all, prepared to clear out her belongings, to put an end to the months-long ordeal. They expected a mess. They expected an abandoned home. They did not expect a graveyard. The moment they stepped inside, the truth began to unravel. The stench hit them first, thick. Rotten. Overpowering. At first, they thought it was garbage left to decay. But then they saw the freezer. A heavy, old thing, sitting in the corner. Unplugged. And when they opened it, the nightmare finally revealed itself. 2 small bodies, wrapped in plastic, frozen together in death. Kira and Zamir. Trapped in ice for 2 years. The eviction ended that very moment. This wasn't about unpaid rent anymore. This was murder. And Shanice Lavelle, the monster responsible, was nowhere to be found. A manhunt began, siren blaring, streets swarming with officers searching for the woman who had kept her children's corpses hidden in her home. Hours later, they found her sitting in a friend's house, her surviving children beside her. When they stormed inside, guns drawn, voices shouting, she didn't resist. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply smirked as they cuffed her and led her away. As if the deaths of her own children meant nothing to her at all. The story spread like wildfire. News stations ran 24-hour coverage, headlines screamed of the unthinkable horror, and social media erupted in shock and outrage. The world demanded answers. How could this happen? How could a mother do this to her own children? And more importantly, why did no one stop her? As investigators pieced together the truth, a picture of pure, calculated cruelty emerged. Medical examiners found that Nyla bore the scars of years of torment, fractured bones that had never healed properly, burn marks etched into her skin like permanent reminders of her suffering. Her body told a story they never could. Then, there were Kira and Zamir. The autopsies were brutal, confirming what many feared. They had suffered slow, agonizing deaths, their final moments filled with pain no child should ever endure. Kira's skin had been boiled away, her lungs struggling for air as the electrical cord cut off her final screams. Zamir's skull showed fractures from repeated blunt force trauma, his body so malnourished that forensic experts wondered how he had even been alive before the final beating. And yet, no one had noticed they were gone. Family members admitted they hadn't seen the children in years. When they asked about them, Shanice always had an excuse: they were with their father, they had moved out of state, they were in a special program for troubled kids. Lies, so many lies. And they believed her. No one pushed further. No one checked. The outrage grew. How had Child Protective Services failed? How had teachers, doctors, and neighbors turned a blind eye? Some pointed to her past, her own childhood of violence and suffering. They said she had been raised in abuse, that she never knew love, that she was simply repeating what had been done to her. That she was as much a victim as she was a monster. But others refused to accept that. They saw her for what she had become, a predator, someone who chose to hurt, to kill, to cover up her crimes. They said her past didn't excuse her actions, that plenty of people endure abuse but don't become murderers. That she could have broken the cycle, but instead, she embraced it. Shanice Lavelle had fooled the world for years. But now, her secrets were out, her horrors exposed for all to see. And the world would never forget what she had done. The trial of Shanice Lavelle was one of the most disturbing in recent history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and grieving family members, some seeking answers, others seeking justice. Shanice sat at the defense table, expressionless, as the prosecution laid out the horrifying details of her crimes. The jury listened in stunned silence as medical examiners described the extent of Kira and Zamir's injuries, how their bodies had been burned, beaten, and broken before they were stuffed into that freezer like discarded trash. The autopsy reports painted a picture so gruesome that some jurors visibly recoiled. The prosecution spared no mercy, calling Shanice a sadistic, remorseless killer who viewed her children as nothing more than objects to dominate and destroy. They revealed how she continued to collect welfare benefits for her murdered children, proving that she had no grief, no regret, only greed. They called witnesses, including former neighbors who admitted they had heard the screams but never intervened, and social workers who had failed to take action despite reports of suspected abuse. The defense, in contrast, tried to paint a different picture. They claimed Shanice was a product of her own upbringing, a woman so deeply damaged by the abuse she suffered as a child that she could no longer distinguish discipline from cruelty. They brought in psychological experts who argued that she suffered from severe trauma, possibly even dissociative episodes. But even they struggled to explain how she had managed to maintain a normal social life, how she had deceived family members for years, how she had laughed and joked online while her children's corpses rotted in her home. When the jury left to deliberate, there was no doubt about what the verdict would be. They were gone for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood and read the verdict in a firm, unwavering voice. Guilty on all charges. First-degree murder. Child abuse. Welfare fraud. Shanice Lavelle had been convicted. There was no reaction from her, no tears, no pleading, not even a flicker of emotion. She sat there as if the verdict had been expected, as if none of it mattered. At sentencing, the judge wasted no time delivering the maximum penalty. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He looked Shanice in the eye as he spoke, his voice steady but filled with unmistakable disgust. This is not about a cycle of abuse. This is about a woman who made the choice to become a monster. You were given the chance to be better than the pain you endured, and instead, you became the very thing you should have feared. You will never see the outside of a prison cell again. And that, Shanice Lavelle, is justice. Even then, she showed nothing. No remorse. No sadness. No fear. As the bailiff secured her in shackles and led her away, she remained as cold and lifeless as the freezer where her children had been entombed for 2 years. The doors of the courtroom shut behind her, sealing her fate. This case is a haunting reminder of how the sins of the past can shape the horrors of the present. Shanice Lavelle was raised in pain, and instead of breaking the cycle, she continued it in the most brutal way imaginable. Kira and Zamir suffered unimaginably, their lives stolen by the one person meant to protect them. Nyla and Kaysen now bear the scars of their mother's cruelty, a reminder that monsters are often those closest to us. Could Shanice have been saved from becoming a monster? Do we do enough to stop the cycle of abuse before it's too late? If this case horrified you, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more cases that reveal the darkest depths of human nature.